Colleagues, our exchange of views today will focus on the demolitions of EU-funded projects and structures in Palestine and on the escalation of settlers' violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. For this discussion, we have the pleasure to welcome Mr. Michael Mann, Head of Division for the Middle East, Israel, Occupied Palestinian Territories and the Middle East Peace Process from the External Action Service. We also have Mr. Giovanni Di Girolamo, Head of Unit for Neighbourhood and Middle East from DG ECHO. And we also have Mr. Andrea Domenico, Head of the Westfield Bank Coordination Unit from the UN, and Mohammed Shahada, our speaker to my left here, Chief of Communications for Euromed Human Rights Monitor.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the previous speakers for their remarkable and insightful contribution. It's difficult to add anything substantial after that, but I will try. So I am from the Gaza Strip myself, and we usually look up to the West Bank with a sense of envy. As Palestinians in the West Bank, we perceive them to be better off, more opportunities, less restrictions, an ability to make a living, interactions with foreigners in and out, things that we don't have in Gaza. But over the last year in particular, I've been sensing, and my colleagues as well, from interviewing Palestinians from different walks in life in the West Bank, even in affluent so-called bubble cities like Ramallah and East Jerusalem, we sense a great perception or common feeling amongst Palestinians of an impending disaster, existential threat. And we sense a growing level of despair that is very comparable to Gaza, that is leading young Palestinians, in particular in the West Bank, to think about leaving. Similar brain drain that Gaza has been suffering for the last many years. The feeling or perception of an existential threat is compounded by increased exposure to settler violence, but also very hostile Israeli government rhetorics that explicitly state that the Palestinian dream of national statehood must be taken off the table and destroyed. This is literally what ministers in the Israeli government are saying, and not just any ministers, the de facto ruler of the West Bank, Minister Bezalel Smotrich. We see a shift in terms of the Israeli government. Previous ones were very blatant in the sense of saying that any Palestinian construction in Area C is illegal, although they issue almost zero permits when Palestinians request any. Israel issued only 66 permits to Palestinians in Area C between 2009 and 2016. And about 36 of these permits were permits to relocate. So the percentage is close to zero. But they call it illegal nonetheless. So we saw ministers in the Israeli government like Avi Dechter and previous ones saying that Palestinian construction in Area C is construction terrorism, or calling it a virus. But now with the new Israeli government, we see a more dangerous and more blatant framing of Palestinian presence in Area C. And that was stated by Minister Smotrich on the eve of forming the government. He wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal in which he was ironically trying to appear as a moderate and trying to frame himself to an American audience as not as extreme as you think he is. And in that article, he explicitly says that what we are trying to prevent is, quote, the Palestinian takeover of Area C. And he frames it differently, saying that Area C is the only area in the West Bank in which Jews are still allowed to live and build. So poor us, we need to stop Palestinians from trying to steal Area C, which is the majority of the West Bank. And this sentiment is echoed by members of his party, like Limor Sonhar Melech, who wrote also on the eve of the government's formation on Facebook, I think on January 13th, she wrote a post in which she said, I have two missions in this Knesset. Number one, to destroy the so-called Fayyad plan, funded by the EU, of course. Now they frame the EU as a complicit partner in the endangerment of Israel's future. So number one, she said, we need to eradicate Palestinian presence in the Area C. We need to stop the takeover of Area C. And number two, we need to build outposts and settlements on every hill and every piece of land in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. And this is not rhetorical, they're basically acting on it. The other existential threat is, of course, the Israeli government is moving from a long-standing approach of weakening the Palestinian Authority into trying to actually collapse it. You have ministers like Smotrich and Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir explicitly saying that we don't need the PA. And they perceive it as a zero-sum game, so they think that it's in Israel's best interest to collapse the PA without a consideration of the consequences because it's an impediment in the path of full annexation. So in that regard, we have also a different approach that is forming now gradually, but certainly under Minister Smotrich, in which it's not only preventing Palestinian presence in Area C, but he also actually wants to prevent Palestinian presence in all the open areas of the West Bank. So confining Palestinians to the encagement that they are trapped in these cities, and any attempt to build in Area A or B that are supposed to be under the Palestinian Authority's civil control, Minister Smotrich wants now to frame it as an issue of national security. So based on security grounds, he wants to be able to go into Area A and B and destroy Palestinian construction in open spaces. So now it's not just the war in Area C, but on all open spaces in the West Bank. The other trend that the distinguished speakers before me have elaborated on is the issue of Israeli settlers now accomplishing what the Israeli government has failed to do over the last 2 decades. So I think since 1999, and I checked with Israeli sources, the Israeli government has not been able to substantially displace entire Palestinian communities on a massive scale. The last one, 1999, was in the South Hebron Hills. And this was due in large part to a protective shield that was successfully established by international pressure, legal pressure, humanitarian aid, Palestinian activism on the ground, the Palestinian Authority challenging Israeli measures. But now Israeli settlers have found a way around this protective shield. And it's basically by, number one, building unauthorized herding outposts all around the West Bank that are responsible for driving Palestinians out and isolating them economically, driving them out of grazing lands and weakening them so that they don't have any source of income. There's about now 50 of these unauthorized outposts. I think about 40 of them were established during Trump's presidency, 10 were established recently. And the number two is basically explicit, and I cannot emphasize that enough, explicit settler terrorism. I know there's a lot of reluctance to call it as such in Brussels, but the US, the Biden administration, is getting there. The last statement by the State Department was describing Israeli settler violence as settler terrorism. So going into Palestinian communities and basically threatening women and children with guns and drugs and improvised weaponry. So these go hand in hand, herding outposts, settler terrorism or settler violence. And it's been successful in emptying most of the area between Jericho and Ramallah, the very heart, the very middle of the West Bank, of emptying it out of entire Palestinian communities. So the 7 communities in total, some of them in the South Hebron Hills, some of them in between Jericho and Ramallah, of just driving Palestinians completely off. And you cannot precisely say that it's supported by the central or financed by the central government. Of course, there is condoning and support and tacit support, but you can say that it enjoys this decentralized support from the regional settlement council and the councils across the West Bank, from pro-Israeli organizations abroad that encourage settlers to go and take more land, to improvise outposts, and to go and try to drive Palestinians out of space and territory. And it's been working in the sense, as we saw in Ain Samiyah, that the Israeli army works hand in hand with the settlers. The settlers drove the community out. Then the army went in and it destroyed an EU-funded school in the area to make sure Palestinians will not return again. And I think the most recent estimate is that settlers with these herding outposts have managed to drive and render inaccessible about 10% of Area C, about 337 dunums in Area C that are inaccessible to Palestinians for grazing because of settler attacks. I will be very brief. Yes. So going now to conclude very quickly with the EU coming into the picture. I will try with the Berger model, something positive, something negative, something positive. So I'll start with the positive. I think by funding these structures to begin with, and I've consulted with a lot of colleagues, European, Palestinian, Israelis, that said this is precisely the best thing the EU is doing. Funding Palestinian presence in Area C, cooperating with the Palestinian Authority on not just on humanitarian projects, but also on developmental projects. And it is the best thing that they are doing because the retention rate, the level of EU-funded projects that are not destroyed by Israel, the latest figure put them at 91%, which is a great success. It's a war of attrition, of seeing who has most patience. And in that sense, the EU, by funding projects across the occupied territories, is winning that war of attrition. The retention rate is very high. But at the same time, there is the issue, it's a routinely issue with the Consortium for the Protection of the West Bank, or the West Bank Protection Consortium, that issues these periodic statements demanding compensation from Israel. It's very good rhetorically. It makes a very powerful political statement, but it does not have any impact on the ground. Israeli ministers like Gabi Ashkenazi, foreign minister a few years ago, simply just tossed it into the trash. He said, I reject this out of hand. If the EU builds illegally in the West Bank, we will go and destroy it. There's nothing to do about that. We're not paying compensation. So in that sense, it's good that they are issuing these statements. It's bad that they are sufficing with these statements and not taking more action on that. And here I think it's important to contemplate, although it might not be an easy measure, but to move from demanding compensation to actually taking compensation, to deduct the amounts of Israeli destruction inflicted on European-funded projects from the EU budget for bilateral cooperation with Israel, to try to take away that in compensation, to make a strong statement, not just a rhetorical one. The other thing, I think, there's a lot of talk always in Brussels of we don't have EU unity. That's the easiest thing to say whenever you ask the critical question. We don't have internal EU unity. We need unanimous voting on this matter. Therefore, we will not do anything. You need more investment to actually build this consensus to begin with, and we sense that there is not actually an effort to build it. We saw an effort, for instance, with the issue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war of aggression in Ukraine, the EU going in and convincing Hungary to vote in favor of sanctions and other measures on the ground. We don't see that level of pressure when it comes to the occupied territories. But I think it's equally important not just to rely on, let's say, the bureaucratic structures of Brussels, but on members of the European Parliament here. You have a very powerful and open mandate to speak your mind without constraints that are imposed on your colleagues in the External Action Service or the Council or the Commission. You can actually speak up without constraints. And making this sort of good noise acts as a deterrent, that what's happening in the West Bank is being noticed and it's not going to go unpunished. And we are going to shine more and more light on it as a deterrent. And in that sense, it's important for members of Parliament to speak up and name things the way they are. Start with settler terrorism. Don't be as reluctant as, let's say, previous statements have been. You need to name things the way they are. And the other thing is to designate settler groups as terrorist organizations, the most violent ones, to call on the EU Commission to issue travel bans against most prominent violent settler activists. But the other important issue that I will conclude with is to recognize that forcible transfers are happening. The Belgian Minister of International Cooperation, a few days ago, she said that publicly. She got heavily attacked by the Israeli government. It's important that she's not the only one saying that. You need to recognize that forcible transfers are happening, and you need to hold Israel's government accountable for these transfers, because the Israeli military is the one accompanying settlers when they go chasing Palestinians out of grazing land, when they go attacking Palestinian villages. The Israeli government is the one arming the settlers and giving them weapon licenses. Israel's government is the one paving the roads for the settlers to walk on and ascend in Palestinian villages. You need to hold them accountable for that issue. And one way to hold them accountable, and I conclude, I promise here, is the Association Council. You have an upcoming meeting with the Association Council that Israel is expected to be invited to. If you let it pass without any conditions vis-à-vis Israel's behavior on the ground, it would only signal weakness to the Israeli government and to settlers. I think what should be done on the EU level with the Association Council meeting is don't be more Catholic than the Pope. Israelis themselves, former prime ministers of Israel like Ehud Olmert, is calling on the world to boycott this Israeli government and condition meeting with Netanyahu and his cabinet on concrete steps on the ground. So don't be more to the right of the Israeli right. In that sense, I would say that condition the Association Council meeting on Israel removing at least these unauthorized, illegal, under Israeli law, unauthorized, illegal herding outposts, number one, and taking concrete measures to stop settler raids on Palestinian communities, and also to take concrete measures in order or in terms of protecting EU-funded projects. On the other side, there's the issue that the EU has not even made a list of possible actions to present to member states to say, this is what we can do, what do you think about this, do you agree or not? That was recently the answer of an EU commissioner, that we haven't even made a list of possible actions to discuss with member states. So make a list of action, as simple as that, it's intuitive. And the last one is don't meet Israeli government extremists. The EU made a very strong and remarkable statement when they disinvited Israeli Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, and they said that he holds views that we do not agree with, so we're not inviting him to our event in Tel Aviv. But last week, the EU representative to Israel, along with representatives of European member states, they met with an equally extremist Israeli minister. Literally, in Israel, they call her the Minister of Propaganda, Minister Lahasbara, propaganda or public diplomacy, Galit Distel Atabarian, who said that Palestinians are, quote, and I quote verbatim, murderers brainwashed to seek Jewish blood since age 0. She also said that the protests in Tel Aviv are funded by, quote, Iran and Germany. And then you honor that minister by meeting with her and posting it on Twitter on the official account of the EU mission to Israel and saying, we celebrate our shared values. So don't platform extremists in the government. I think most hope, and I conclude here briefly, one sentence, most hope I have is on the parliament. Try to speak up as much as you can. Say the things that your colleagues, your bureaucratic colleagues in Brussels are not able to say in order to maintain a good relationship with the Israeli government. Name things by their name, settler violence, forcible transfers, and keep submitting questions to the EU Commission. Keep making a good noise. And lastly, visit the ground. Be on the ground as much as possible and meet with Palestinians to create a sense that the world has not moved on from their cause yet, that they're not isolated, because this is the perception that the Israeli government is trying to sell to the Palestinians, that you are on your own. Thank you.